Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 20th anniversary series, special lectures. And today I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Albion Butters, who has agreed to join us from Europe to give us today, to share with us some of his work that on the 14th century cultural and religious history. Dr. Albion Butters has an MPhil and PhD in the history of religions from Columbia University, an MTS from Harvard Divinity School, and he's a double major in French and comparative religions. And he has worked on many things. He has been a consultant, a reviser. He has worked for the Academy of Finland Research. He was a research fellow there, and he has a very diverse background, which is attested also in his CV, but also in his publications. He's currently the editor for the Khyentse Vision Project, a project whose mission is to translate the collected works of Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo, which we probably will hear more about it, I think, in his next lecture next week, same time, same place. And he's also the editor for Studia Orientalia Electronica, which is an online and peer-reviewed open access journal in Asian and African studies. His publications are really diverse, from topics that have to do with gun control in Texas, or all the way to works of art, Indological work. And I think for our purposes here, I just want to highlight among his many publications, his work on Dzogchen, which is, I believe, based on his also, to some extent, on his doctoral thesis at the University of British Columbia. And the title is Illuminating the Gold, Dzogchen and Doxography in 14th Century Tibet. It was published by the Finnish Oriental Society in 2018, and I believe it's open access. So if anyone wants to read about Dzogchen and how the doxography developed around this corpus of texts and practices, I highly recommend this work. Without taking more time, I'd like to welcome our speaker. Please join me all to welcome Albion. Hi, Albion.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Halkias, and thank you everyone for joining. It's an honor to be here and speak to you all today. This has been a lecture that I've been looking forward to deliver for a while. It's based, as Dr. Halkias mentioned, on my publication, which goes into more detail about the Dzogchen side. But really, the content of this particular talk today will be focusing more on the cultural and spiritual history of the 14th century and some of the main luminaries, the who's who of that period, in order to, how would you say, underline the significance of this period in particular, why it was special, why I chose to do my dissertation on it originally, and at the same time, as going over a broad context of the period, I would like to kind of use the main figure that I did my research on, Longchenpa, Kyunken Longchen Rabjam, a luminary of the 14th century. He's often known as the omniscient Longchenpa, as a lens, because I'm familiar with his work in particular, and his relationships with the other figures in that period proved to be a very interesting angle of how to access what was going on there. Obviously, he wasn't the only person doing things, and there were some giants in Tibetan history during this period. So we'll touch on them in this lecture right now. So to move directly into it then, I will begin by giving a little overview of the greater context of 14th century Tibet. Like I said, Longchenpa will be the lens, but many things were going on during this period. You had a divided political landscape. canon was being created, which is to say what texts were decided to be the official texts. And this would shape the curriculum for the different schools and what they taught in monasteries for centuries to come. So it was very important on that level. You also had a very open period of debate in relation to the different philosophical schools at this time. And so you have competing philosophies that hasn't been, set in stone, which is the definitive school yet. And then also we have tensions arising out of different ways of transmitting texts, and again, understanding which texts are authentic or not. So before diving into the 14th century, I would like to take us back just 100 years to give a bit of context to where the situation, where we pick up with. So if we remember that the 13th century saw Tibet put under Mongol rule, this is something that Tibet, in a way, agreed to, because they saw that other countries that fought against the Mongols didn't fare so well. They established a relationship of a patron priest relationship that they actually sent lamas up to teach to the Mongol Khans, and gained great respect among them. You had, feats of magic with Karma Pakshi, doing miracle competitions against the Taoists, and, the Confucians are the judges, and the Khans are sitting there with their Nestorian wives, and the shamans. I mean, it was a very ecumenical setting. And the point of all of this is that Tibet really rose in that larger milieu as a very important place, as it was recognized for the special treasure that it was and what it held in terms of the Dharma, especially Tibetan Buddhist tradition of Tantra, that it had incorporated from India at that point. And in practice, the Khans allowed Tibet to continue much like it had in centuries before, but they established, with their administrative tendency to, they established 13 myriarchies. And this is important for the 14th century, as we'll see. Myriarchies are kind of like counties, right? Different administrative zones. And they said, okay, the Sakya school of the different schools that they favored, let's favor them, give them control of these myriarchies. One would see a bit of how would you say, resentment from some of the other schools in Tibet, however, that the Sakyas were assigned this prestigious and administrative power over the other schools. Well, this led to a uprising, for example, at the end of the 13th century by the Drikung school, that led to it was a violent uprising that led to the Sakya overlords basically rolling in and destroying an entire monastery and killing all of the monks. It was one of the most violent and bloody moments in the history of Tibet. But what this does is this just highlights what is going to be in the 14th century, the civil war and unrest that is simmering under the surface and then erupting at different moments in history. So from the very beginning, I would like to, to paint a picture that we don't have a unified, homogeneous government at this point, but rather one that has been placed on Tibet with conflicting, power groups and structures that are trying to emerge. And in the 14th century, that will really all pass as the Yuen dynasty of the Mongols itself passes, right? And entering the Ming dynasty in the second part of the 14th century. So what is Tibet like at this time? One could just pull back for a second, and it's not highly populated. Census numbers are revealing that there were approximately 30,000 families at that time. Central Tibet was the Yarlung Valley of central Tibet was where a large part of the population existed. However, it ranged all the way to in the west to the older areas back to the mythical kingdom of Zahor. You could trace that all the way to the east to the areas of Amdo and Kham. And where we're focusing today, however, is in the central area. So to give again a bit of context about this period of time, it was not an easy time environmentally. All around the globe, there was what was called the Little Ice Age. Temperatures were less than normal. Life was not as easy. Agriculture was not as plentiful. And the other thing is that, as we'll see, well, we won't get into it so much here, but you will have certainly heard of the Black Plague, right? Well, the Black Plague didn't only extend to Europe. It also, as you know, extended into China in the 14th century. And this is something that Tibet largely escaped, but it was still an important factor. It's a very interesting bit of research that remains to be done, exactly how that collided with Tibetan culture. So as we move into the political landscape of the 14th century, here's the slide that gives a little bit of a map and context for the Yuen dynasty. And as I mentioned before, you have these different factors with the environmental stresses and the Black Plague. Apologies for introducing this slide late. Let's move now to the political landscape. And we have, as a result of the imposition of these hierarchies, different warlords rising up, different clans saying, "Hey, you can't just take away our rights." Because if you remember, this Tibet spans all the way back to the imperial period. We're 6 centuries after that, and there were established power dynamics that were quite strong. You have fortresses and these zongs that were strategically placed in the valley and had military control, and suddenly to then say that belonged to someone else was obviously a problem. One of the main players at this point in time was the Pagmadrupa dynasty. And this is a school, there's a subsect of the Kagyu school of Tibetan Buddhism. Just as context for the Kagyu school, if we have just a basic context, I'm sure many of you are familiar, but we have the Nyingma, the old school. We have the Kagyu school that harkens back to the great yogi Milarepa. We have the Sakya school, and one could say really initiated through the luminary Sakya Pandita, and then the Kadampa school that will later move to the Gelug school in name. So this subsect of the Kagyu school, the Pagmadrupa school, is the first to really say, this fortress, our Neodong fortress belongs to us. You can't take it. And they had looked to establish who would challenge the powers that be, so to speak. And the old head of that dynasty, the Pagmadrupa dynasty, he wasn't interested in this. He was a very religious person. And it just goes to show that in Tibet, both the secular and the religious were often aligned, and that families would offer one of the monks, one of their sons as a monk, another would be a politician, but it's not to say that there wasn't a dynamic relationship between those roles sometimes. In this case, this leader said, I don't want to get into this, embroiled in this. he handed it off to his younger brother, who was 20 years old. His name was Chongshu Gyaltsen. Here you see his dates, 1302 to 1364. And he was not such a religious type. He had no problem being a politician, and he began appeals to Sakya on a formal level. Please, like this doesn't work. Well, even as he was doing that, another clan, the Yazang clan, came in to take advantage of the Pagmadrupa's weakened position and started raiding them. Well, this created a situation in central Tibet where multiple players were basically in violent conflict, and he was arrested as the figurehead behind the Pagmadrupa rebellion. At that point, it wasn't even a rebellion. It was more formal requests to back off, you might say. Well, he was arrested, and one could say he was even fortunate to live, because the martial law, the situation could be quite rough. He was beaten, he was flogged, and even in the midst of this, however, he was able to burn his sandalwood seal. It's an interesting historical note that gets passed down to us, which means that nobody could take it and then in his name assume control of the Pagmadrupa dynasty. Well, the long story short, he escaped or was released from prison, and at that point it got quite violent. It emerged. There emerged a civil war with the Sakya school in Tibet, and for the next 20 years, we're talking, the 20s and the 30s and the 40s of the 14th century, we have armies, burning down forests and attacking fortresses and burning them down. So this is not an easy time. At a certain period, however, the Mongols realized what was going on, and they finally even gave him power, Chongshu Gyaltsen power. They appointed him to be Tai Situ in a formal role in the mid part of the century. And this was the decline of the Sakya school in Tibetan Buddhism, in Tibet for many years to come. With the fall of the Mongols, one would see the rise of the Kagyu school. But for this brief moment, you have the Pagmadrupa with Chongshu Gyaltsen at the head. This is important, as we will see, with the other things I will be talking about in terms of canon creation and in terms of Longchenpa and the promulgation of the Dzogchen teachings. As I mentioned, there were new administrative titles that were given by the Mongols to allow him to step up. This idea of Tai Situ is a new title. Also, Desi was another one. And essentially, this period saw a type of nationalism, a nationalist revival in Tibet, which harkened back to the imperial period. So people thought, oh, we have to remember who we are above and against the Mongols. Let us wear our Tibetan traditional clothes. Let us remember our culture. And this wasn't a problem for the Mongols, but it was something that I think really contributed to the survival of Tibetan culture. This idea of pride and nationalism during the 14th century. All right. Now I believe we could move to the next item, which of significance during this period is the creation of the canon, what would be known as the official canon used in monasteries of the different schools. So I would like to briefly read from Bourdieu's definition controlling the narrative. What is at stake in the struggles about the meaning of the social world is power over the classificatory schemes and systems which are the basis of the representations of the groups, and therefore of their mobilization and demobilization, the evocative power of an utterance which puts things in a different light. So obviously this is out of context, 20th century postmodernism, but it applies to this 14th century in the sense that you had people that were very, very focused on framing a certain type of Buddhism in Tibet as being the way that it should continue and survive and be taught. And this was over and against a different form, the older form from the imperial period. So that led to two different traditions that you may be familiar with. There's the Nyingma, or the old school, and the Sarma, or the new school. Many of the later schools, Kagyus, the Sakyapas, the Kadampas, they fit within this Sarma meaning new, right? So they had their idea of what texts that had been brought from India and translated were definitive, were authoritative, whereas the Nyingma school had their earlier recension of texts that had been translated. This is what I'm talking about of controlling the narrative. One of the main figures in this struggle, and when I say struggle, I would like to not overemphasize it, because it's not like they were going to war like the rest of the country was in civil war about what texts, fighting over like this is this book. On one level, no, they weren't doing that. On another level, if you think that, well, the pen is mightier than the sword, and controlling the narrative would actually have a very, very significant effect for centuries to come, what happened here it should not be ignored. One of the main figures is this fellow Butön, who was himself aligned with the Sakya school, which is to say the powers that be. And at the same time, he had a very good relationship with the Pakma Drupa warlord, Trungpa Gyaltsen. So he was able to play both sides. I think this was something that was largely the case of the different schools, the monastic schools, that they didn't themselves want to enter the fray. They didn't want to get burned down like it happened to the Drikungpa, 30 years before. So how did he go about creating a canon? One had already seen large printing presses, such as Derge, Peking editions, being promulgated in Tibet. We're seeing the advent of block printing at this time, rather than hand copying the texts. And we already see a group of monks at the monastery of Nartung giving a first stab at what texts belong to the canon. As context for these editions, we would see that the Kangyur, the teachings given by the Buddha himself, numbered something like 1,046 texts in 104 volumes. And then you have the Tengyur, which are the Shastras, the commentaries on those, in 3,786 texts in 185 volumes. These are very specific numbers, of course. And why? Why am I able to give these very specific numbers? It's because somebody at a certain point said, that's it. That we're closing the door. No longer, no more, none are being added. That's the canon. One could almost, draw a parallel to, Christianity, that there were the accepted texts and the Gospels and the epistles, etc., and those other ones that weren't, they were seen as apocryphal. They were outside of the tradition, right? Well, the difference is in Tibet is there was the Nyingma school, and you have somebody that, well, Longchenpa, that I focused on, that was pushing back on this. He was a Nyingma. And so he was giving his own, how would you say, attempt at presenting what texts were authoritative is not the right word. That wasn't his agenda. He wasn't trying to control the narrative. He was more arguing and pushing back a little bit and saying, no, this one is acceptable. So two different types of things going on. One, the powers that be pushing towards a codification and a locking down of the canon, and the other side, the more marginalized side, pushing back as much as they could, but not succeeding. So I would mention also the Tongbo monastery, the Kabum at Salgung Tung Monastery, this Li Tung edition that I have on the left side, as another one that is important to keep in mind, that just to give the picture once again that there's a complex environment of you don't only have the Nartong monks doing it, you don't only have Butun doing it, you have the Li Tung edition too. They join with the rest of the canon creation and the accepted number of texts, but maybe theirs differ a little bit. If you look back from a text critical viewpoint at this period, you see slight variations in the different editions. And why is that? It's because the translations may have differed over the periods of time since the imperial period. For context, a large number of the texts had been brought to Tibet 6 centuries before, but then others filtered in over the centuries until we get to the 14th century. It's really then that we find the whole corpus assembled, like it's been gathered. It's only after it's been gathered can then the people come and say, now let's lock the door, right? But what's interesting for me about this period, why I think of this period as a renaissance, is that there was an amazing amount of work done with the translation, and not just linguistic translation, but cultural translation of bringing Tibet into a more and more Buddhist, but also awareness of Tantric Buddhism. The technologies had been being fine-tuned over the centuries until by the 14th century, it's really at this golden age of the knowledge being there and the libraries being there, the universities being there. Not that they hadn't been before, but they've been built to a place of sophistication by this point. So that's a very important thing in relation to this canon creation, that there was an intelligentsia, there were academic environments in which the canon was actually used and discussed and debated. It wasn't only theoretical and it wasn't only practiced. It was a merging of both of these at the same time. So to go a little bit more into this detail with Butun and his agenda, he purposefully excluded many Dzogchen texts, many of the Nyingma texts from the canon. He approximately 3 volumes worth. I figured that they were not worth being included, or maybe they weren't real. Why? Because they hadn't been existent in India, believing that somebody in Tibet made them up. And therefore, the idea of authenticity, we could say, was really based on India. And if the text was not found there, if a translation could not be proven to go back to that period in time, then it did not qualify for the canon. So one very famous example of that he did not include is the Guhyagarbha Tantra, which is, if not the most important Mahayana Tantra for the Nyingma school, certainly among the top ones. Another one would be the Kunche Gyalpo. And these are texts that later scholars, Western scholars, have been able to trace this back and say, oh, indeed, it did exist in India. But of course, in the 14th century, they didn't have all of those tools, ability to centralize text and have that text critical awareness. So, okay, so that's one. At the same time that this is being done, a history of Tibet is being written, the famous Chujung text of the 14th century, that is framed in the nationalist light of Tibet that I mentioned before. So on one hand, we have India is the authentic tradition. On the other hand, we have Tibet is the historical tradition, our tradition, and we need to remember our tradition, but in relation to India. How did Tibet see itself? It was that the great Dharma kings, whether it was Songtsen Gampo or Trisong Detsen of the 8th, 7th, and 8th centuries, they were in relation to the Buddhism that came from India, as opposed to the indigenous religious strains that were happening. You know all this, I'm sure, from Professor Halkias's teachings. So as we move more into this question of Dzogchen being kind of thrown out, well, what was Dzogchen? A famous Tibetologist, Per Caverna, has described it during this time period as a religious underground. So the Nyingmas themselves, they were kind of like these pirates, right? Or maybe that's not exactly the right word, but an underground that they didn't have the same institutions, the same large monasteries. They weren't being supported by the Mongols, and they weren't interested in fighting these civil wars. You don't find the Nyingma there. You find them more isolated, if the difference perhaps being that the Nyingma school does not put as much emphasis on becoming a monk. It's very possible to become enlightened as a lay person. So what does that mean? That means that transmissions happen on a local level in a tiny village, inside a family. Maybe your uncle is the Lama and you receive the transmission from him. Maybe your grandmother is the amazing practitioner and you learn on her lap, as opposed to going off to a monastery to receive teachings. Well, this is not to say, however, that the Nyingma school was not integrated into the larger structure. Just because they were kind of the religious underground didn't mean that you didn't have people coming into the universities from the Nyingma school, for example. An example of that is Longchenpa. He's a great academic. He's regarded as when I say the omniscient Longchenpa, he's regarded as one of the great three omniscients in the history of Tibet, Kunkien, and for his academic prowess as well as his yogic understanding of Dzogchen. So this is an important thing to keep in mind, that there's an integration, not only a division going on. But to return to this idea of Bhutan, I mentioned that he was on one side between the Sakyas and the Pakmadrupas, favored by both. He was pushing back on the anybody that made waves on the political level, and our friend Longchenpa here was one of those people, as we'll see. So it's possible that the canon creation and debates that were happening between these two figures also did have a bit of a political undertone. We have to remember that this is a small, relatively small area that we're talking about, the Yarlung Valley, and within a very, very defined first half of the 14th century. And these are important people within their different traditions. So when I'm mentioning them, even though that there is no historical, there are no letters going back and forth between them, it would be very difficult to argue, I think, that they didn't know each other, they didn't know of each other, they didn't have relationships not only with each other, but with the larger matrix of power players in that period. So, for example, Longchenpa, when I mentioned he pushes back against Bhutan in this canon creation and ignoring these texts, he wrote his own book, the Drupdazu, which you'll see down here at the bottom. That's the text that I worked on when I was at Columbia. And it's a work of doxography, which basically means it's a classification of knowledge systems. Other doxographies in Tibet primarily focus on philosophy and which philosophical school is the most definitive, which one is the best, and which is both intellectually but also soteriologically, which is the best for getting enlightened. Longchenpa does something a bit different with his doxography. He looks at the different schools, not different schools, but the different vehicles. He puts the Sutrayana, those people that follow the sutras, which is to say Mahayana, in relation to Tantrayana. And then he breaks down the Sarma Tantras, the new translation school, versus the Nyingma translation school of Tantras. He doesn't do this in a judgmental way of saying that the Sarma Tantras are not good. He simply adds the Nyingma after the Sarma school, saying maybe they're a little bit better. Because in doxography, if you mention something after the other thing, that means it's better. So the thing that comes last is the best. And that's how he concludes with the different tantras. He starts, you have the 3 outer tantras, then you have the 3 inner tantras. Ati Yoga, that relates to Dzogchen, that comes last in his presentation because it's the best. Okay? It's in this presentation of Dzogchen that one finds him start to give some pushback against Bhutan. This is where things get a little interesting. So I'll read a quote. And one might think that he is actually speaking about Bhutan here. This is at least my argument. He writes, that is to say, lacking intellectual vision that actually sees, one puts faith in words of interpretable meaning, or the words of those who jealously denigrate teachings due to sectarian attachment. So he's basically saying that those people that are partisan, that because of their being sectarian, they want to favor this school or that political group, they're going to put down other schools, they lack intellectual vision. Okay. By not examining the nature of the teachings, cultivating wrong views, or jealously denigrating teachings for mere worldly gain, one encounters countless obscurations. So not a good thing to go down that path. Finally, he adds, and those of lesser intellect, in other words, those dummies, not comprehending enumerations such as this, what he's writing, and not comprehending enumerations such as this, and speaking with exaggeration and denigration, again, putting things down, say, they are not authentic tantras because they were not famous in India, or they were made by Tibetans. These were the things that the charges brought against them. Denigrating authentic tantras, scriptures, and sutras merely amasses the cause of remaining for a very long time in bad migrations. So the people that do that are going to have bad karma and have very unfavorable rebirths. So that example just kind of goes to show how that there was not a direct argumentation, but one can do a little bit of research into how the power dynamics were happening with the canon creation. I will move on now to the next section. What time check? I would like to just see. Okay, we've got 43. So now we move to competing philosophies. As I mentioned before, this period of time was before Tsongkhapa, the famous Gelugpa philosopher of the 15th century, who would be very, very important for establishing Madhyamaka, Prasangika Madhyamaka as the de rigueur philosophical tradition of Tibet. It's not to say that other traditions didn't continue to flourish after the 15th century, but really that was a big mark in the sand. 100 years before this, however, not quite 100 years when Longchenpa was active, but before Tsongkhapa, we have these other schools, philosophical schools coming up. One of them that's very important to mention here is that of Dolpopa. Dolpopa was one of the leaders of the Jonangpa school. He was the abbot of Jonang Monastery, and he was a rival to Bhutan, who you remember was Sakya. In fact, Bhutan famously refused to debate with Dolpopa. He said, I don't even want to be in the same area as this fellow. Dolpopa was apparently quite a character. He was quite charismatic. He was quite powerful. He was an evangelist of the Kala Chakra Tantra, which is Anuttara Yoga Tantra, unexcelled Yoga Tantra, non-dual of the different tantric traditions. So the highest of the high within the Sarma tantric tradition, and regarded himself and his followers followed in this, that he was an incarnation of Kalki, the Buddha to come. So you might guess from this that he was on a bit of a power trip, but I will not say anything bad about Dolpopa other than through the lens of other Tibetans, teachers that followed, such as Tsongkhapa and Longchenpa, I believe is important to mention in this regard too, and Bhutan, were critical of him for his philosophical understanding. The one thing that he did that is very significant to the 14th century is advancing the other emptiness school of Madhyamaka, known as Shentong. And what's interesting about Shentong is that it fuses, known as Great Madhyamaka also, it fuses the Yogacara school of philosophy with Madhyamaka. And in essence, and amalgamates it within the Tantra tradition as well of Kala Chakra. And this is to say, he redefines emptiness itself. So just to pause here for a second, what is the understanding of emptiness before he does this, right? Well, Yogacara has the 3 levels of understanding really how reality exists on the basis of mind. Let's Yogacara and then its evolution is Chittamatra and understanding in an idealist way the nature of reality, but Madhyamaka going one step further and saying it's not just emptiness of other out there, and then it's in your mind, but actually no, it's empty on both levels, and framing things in terms of the 2 truths. So you have relative truth and you have ultimate truth. Relative truth people are going to disagree, but ultimate truth is the definitive ultimate truth. And what can one actually say about that ultimate truth? This is where the philosophy starts to get, very detailed with the difference between Swatantrika and Prasangika, and ultimately Prasangika says that it's better not to try to say anything. They will rebut. Somebody says something, and no, I rebut that. It's not that. It's not that. It's not that. And it's actually on a philosophical level that one can practice, that one achieves an understanding of emptiness through this. It's not that. It's not that. So imagine that your mind is so developed in these fine points. Somebody is saying that, well, relative reality, okay, that relates to ultimate reality, so we can get close to ultimate reality. And Prasangika says, no, it's not that. Imagine doing that in such a way that through the via negativa, or apophatic understanding of reality, the Hindus had done this earlier with neti, neti, na iti, na iti. It's not that. It's not that. And in practice, it creates a place for your mind to kind of like, there's a space that you can enter into and an understanding of emptiness on a practical level through the philosophical process. So this is where the understanding of emptiness was before Dolpopa came. And he said, no, emptiness is actually over there. And it's actually a fine thing. It exists. It's something that is not impure. It's not, it's the other schools had said it's not connected to relative truth. He said it's you don't have to worry about that. That emptiness is over there. It's not contaminated. It's fine. It's funny that a funny metaphor that my mentor, my advisor, Robert Thurman, an example that he would give was flap Buddhism, that you would, find this other emptiness over there and like just go over there. And how is that even, how does that fit into the teachings of the Buddha? That you're going somewhere else to like, a different place. It assumes a different religious meaning to do that. So without flapping, we find that Longchenpa speaks against this with his own presentation or alternative understanding of emptiness, which is integrating, not going somewhere else, but integrating the understanding of emptiness on a philosophical level, like I just kind of mentioned, with the Dzogchen or tantric levels of practice, that these two are not separated, but they are together. They need to be understood as related to each other. This is one thing that he does in his large doxography that I translated, is that he frames the philosophical school at one stage in the development, and then after that he goes to Tantra, and after that he goes to Dzogchen, that he actually speaks to the relationship between them. This is very significant. It's something that Tsongkhapa later will ignore, and I don't know that how many people really appreciate what he's trying to do here. Later, the Nyingmas do. They hold on to it. But what am I talking about here in particular, just specifically? Apologies for that. There is the idea in the disputation of the evolution of Buddhist teachings that there are different turnings of the wheel. So which school, which philosophical school is the ultimate one? Which is the best one? And some would say that the second turning of the wheel, which focuses on Nagarjuna's teachings of emptiness, are the definitive one. The third teaching of this third turning of the wheel is more focused on the Uttara Tantra, and that you have a how would you say, a more interconnected full understanding of emptiness than the purely apophatic one described by Nagarjuna. What happens with Tsongkhapa is that he divides these really strictly, and he says, if you are a prasangika madhyamaka, the second turning of the wheel is definitive. That's it, case closed. Longchenpa, he says, no, the third turning of the wheel, it's giving an experience of enlightenment as experienced through your mind. It's the Yogacara, the Chittamatra model more that connects with Dzogchen and the luminosity and mind recognition of mind itself. He's saying you can actually be prasangika madhyamaka. That's what he said. I'm that, he said, but third turning is definitive. It's an alternative model that he presented. It's very different from Dolpopa's model. And it actually doesn't suffer from the same heretical view, at least in Tsongkhapa's and later teachers' understandings. It integrates Dzogchen and philosophy, but it doesn't, how would you say, go too far in redefining emptiness. My point here thank you for your patience as I dive into the deep waters of the philosophical schools, is that this is a moment when Tibetan understandings of Buddhist philosophy are really, really alive and being argued, and there is a daring to kind of push the boundaries and understand how things can fit together. So that's something that was going on. Again, kind of a mark of a Renaissance moment of art, taking off. An art of thought. This is another Thurman translation of, upaya or skillful means. If you remember, you have wisdom and skillful means as the two wings of the eagle that lead, to achieving enlightenment. Skillful means can be translated as art. I think it's a really beautiful translation. It's a very effective one because it's how we act in our lives that is really artful. If we're at all awakened, it's how we act and behave. It's conscious, and therefore it could be talked about as art and perhaps even creative. I would like to move now to this aspect of termas and tensions. So many of you are probably familiar with termas, but I will briefly speak to them. In the transmission of Buddhism throughout the centuries in Tibet, you have two main modalities, and one is Kamma and one is Terma. Kamma are the teachings that are transmitted verbally. They can go all the way back to the Buddha. They can go back to luminaries in the imperial period, and they were passed from one person to the next in that way. Termas are, however, a treasure text tradition that was really begun during the imperial period, during the time of Guru Rinpoche, and these termas come to a very, very special significance, and during the 14th century, they are being discovered in numbers that they have not yet before. So let me go into that in a little bit of historical detail. If one were to go back to the imperial period, Guru Rinpoche comes to Lhasa to bring Buddhism, to quell the unrest, both political, but also the forces, the spirits that were destroying monasteries with earthquakes and that type of thing. He brought teachings with him. One of the sets of teachings that he brought, for example, is a body of teachings called the Khandro Nyingtig. He received these teachings from a teacher in India, Sri Senge, and he brought them to Tibet. He gave them to King Trisong Detsen. He gave them to his consort, Yeshe Tsogyo. And then he gave them to the 25 disciples that he had. Around the same time period, the daughter of Trisong Detsen, Princess Pema Sol, she died. I believe she was, only 8 years old at this point. And it was a tragedy. Clearly, he was able to revive her. And during that moment, when she was still alive, he was able to impart the Khandro Nyingtig to her. She passed away then, and he prophesied that she would be reborn centuries later, and that she would reveal this cycle of teachings, the Khandro Nyingtig. Khandro is Dakini, or skygoer, and Nyingtig is kind of like the heart essence. That's what the name means. And that this would be a very important cycle of teachings. So this is but one example of many types of termas that Guru Rinpoche, that Padmasambhava, hid or gave, and that were hidden during the imperial period. But I mention it here because it has direct relationship to our hero, Longchenpa. In his previous life, he was Pema Ledrol Sol, as you see here in the dates. who passed away just at the end of the 13th century and beginning of the 14th century. His dates are uncertain, actually, not only in the beginning part of his life, but at the end period of his life. If you were tracking before, you may have noticed that Longchenpa was born before this fellow passed away. But this is not the first time in Tibetan hagiography that there's this kind of fluid understanding of incarnations and the way that consciousness can work. The person taking the rebirth from somebody that may be still alive. That's the case here. So as we will find that Longchenpa discovers the Khandro Nyingtig in a terma type of way, but he also receives it from one of his disciples who got the teaching from Pema Lodrol Tsol, and that he combines them. So even in this period of discovering a treasure text, what does that mean? That means somebody in a very deep understanding and high level of awakening, they're able to discover, physically find a text that's hidden in, for example, the earth, putting their hand into solid rock and pulling out a scroll, or walking down into a lake and coming out with a bunch of treasures. Or in the case of Longchenpa, someone who was known as a mind terton, having these treasures just appear out of the ether, so to speak, into their mind, and then writing them down. That as far out as that sounds, one could wonder, can't people just be making these things up? There was a very strong tradition of receiving these teachings in a proper way from somebody who had received them and then translated the undecipherable Dakini script and making sense of it and writing it into Pecha format, into Tibetan language, and then giving the teachings to other people, and then commentary on those teachings. And that's why Longchenpa himself couldn't just say, I'm the terton, I'm the treasure discoverer that found this himself. It had already been done before, and he needed to follow a certain protocol, right? So this is all well and good, that there's a system maybe set into place to counterbalance people making things up, right? And yet, maybe this is a little bit, this contributes to our understanding of why the canon creators like Bhutan or the Nartong Monastery were a little suspicious about all of these nyingmas, pulling a text. I pulled it out of a rock, it goes back 6 centuries, right? From their perspective, how that may have looked. So you have the competing strands of authenticity and who is accepted as a real teacher, right? So on one hand, you have a large group of people throughout Tibet that are believing in this Terma tradition quite strongly and giving, how would you say, great respect to those people that come along and give those and discover them, give teachings on them, etc. An example of this would be Orgyen Lingpa, whose name is also on this slide. And he was an important terton or treasure revealer of the 14th century that actually got embroiled in this situation with the political. He actually did, in one of these termas, say the pig will uproot the soil, and that was taken to speak about Shangchup Gyaltsen, Pagmadrupa related to pig in the name, uprooting the soil, being interpreted as starting a civil war. Shangchup Gyaltsen didn't care for that very much. So this fellow was, how would you say, put in the underground, the nyingmas being in the underground, not accepted by the mainstream. He came up with, he discovered texts that were quasi-historical, that gave histories of Tibet going back. Remember that this is the nationalist period. And it, on one level, from a critical point of view, one could say how convenient that he discovers these histories that talk about the the greatness of Tibet. But on another level, it may be that this is the time at which these teachings were the most needed, right? And that it was completely relevant that they would appear at that point to him and be discovered. His history and religious history, the Padmakatang, also discusses Longchenpa, which is a very interesting example of something of one text supporting somebody else that's a contemporary. So this, of course, we have prophecies in the Termas going back to the imperial period saying that somebody will discover this text, it will be very important, and maybe even alluding to who that person is that will discover it. In this case, that person is Longchenpa. So that's something of interest to this Terma tradition. So I would like to share that during this time period of the Khandro Nyingtig, the Terma cycle that I mentioned really came to the fore. Longchenpa got quite famous at this moment, and he became accepted and charismatic, and so much so that eventually he had to go into exile, but then achieved such fame in the end of his life that it didn't matter really what political party people belonged to. They believed in him and revered him. So during the mid part of the 14th century, you had, even as this civil war is going on, a very, very ecumenical university life that's happening. Side by side with the treasure discoverers off on the fringes discovering their texts, on the other side, the monasteries trying to really codify the canon, and then the universities being a melange of people from all these traditions in one place. This is where I have found the history of Longchenpa to be very, very interesting, because he himself is an example of these competing forces. Coming from the Nyingma school, his father was a Nyingma Lama. He grew up in Yarlung Valley next to some of these other people, but that was his background. So he went to Samye Monastery, which was one of the most famous monasteries and is one of the most famous monasteries in Tibet, going back all the way to the 8th century. And here he studied with some of the greatest teachers it didn't matter the tradition. It could be the third Karmapa that was one of his teachers. He received teachings in Chud practice from the Kagyu tradition to the Kalachakra Tantra himself. Very, very wide curriculum. This is during his 20s. He was seen as being very intelligent already at that age, and well, he had a tenure track probably already lined up. He could have slotted into the academic life and been quite happy there, except at a certain point he said, no, this is not what I choose to do. These people are arguing all the time. People are disputing. You had these people come from Kham, renowned for being perhaps a bit more wild, bit barbaric in their customs, I think he mentioned, and that they were arguing all the time. And he got fed up with it, and he left the university. He left not only Samye but the graduate university of Sarangpu Neotok, where he went after Samye. He left, and he said, "I'm going to go practice and put these teachings that I've learned here at the university, into use." So he went and he studied with this fellow Kumara Raja for 3 years, living in a sack, pretty much, and with a bit of flour, bit of barley flour, and some quicksilver pills that were like mercury that he was taking, to subsist on, and underwent amazing austerities and hardships and trials, yogic trials, studying with Kumaraja. After this period of time, this is when he said, okay, now I'm going to go into retreat, and I'm going to even go one step further of putting these into practice. That's when he, as it were, had the doors open and began to receive the termas. The reason why I give this kind of history is to show the evolution of how you could move through the academic into the yogic, and then into this, how would you say, direct relationship with these texts that are existing in a different place, and access that knowledge, and then begin to write them down. With a very small group of followers, 8 men and 8 women, he began to share these teachings that he had received. And over a period of time, they had this, what sounds like a psychedelic adventure, a retreat, in which people, became possessed by the different deities, and he's going into the nature of mind, and what's real, and they're having visions of the protectors, and rainbows are lighting up across the sky, and there's lights here and there, and it sounds completely over the top psychedelic, right? This is something that if you want to look further into this, the Tibetologists Janet Gyatso and David Germano have written a very interesting article on this time period. I'll give you a little just overview of this. It's so interesting. Against the backdrop of these rituals, to say the Khandro Nyingtig, the heart drop teachings, transmissions and celebrations, Longchenpa and his disciples enter a spiritually excited state, which gives rise to a stream of visions and states of possession in the group. During the empowerments, the protectress of Tantra, Nagsungma, entered into one of the yoginis and gave prophecies and instructions. Some of the disciples beheld Longchen Rabcham transforming into his Sambhogakaya form, almost like light body form. A rain of flowers showered down, and arches, beams, and circles of lights of different colors were witnessed all over the mountain. All the assembled people were singing and dancing with overwhelming wisdom energy. Longchen Rabjam saw the vision of Guru Rinpoche and his consort bestowing empowerments and entrusting the transmission of Khandro Nyingtig to him. They gave him the names Orgendrime Özer and Dorje Ziji. Dharma protectors appeared in physical form and accepted the offerings. For a long time, perhaps a month, the minds of the yogi disciples merged into a deep, luminous clarity, which transcends designations of sleeping or waking. Longchen Rabcham sang his yogic energies in verses. O yogis, I am very happy and joyous. Tonight, we are in the unexcelled Pure Land. In our body, the palace of peaceful and wrathful deities, flourishes the assembly of Buddhas, the union of clarity and emptiness. Buddhahood is not somewhere else, but in us. O meditators, you who hold your minds one-pointedly, do not hold your mind at one place, but let it go at ease. Mind is emptiness or openness, whether it goes or where it stays. Whatever arises is the mere play of the wisdom. So I guess you could say he really shifted from the academic here. And what he does is he establishes a context for the Nyingma school for centuries to come of this cycle of teachings, these Terma traditions, whether it's the Peimen Nyingtig, the Kondro Nyingtig, the later commentaries that relate to those, as a body of practice to integrate Dzogchen into rituals, but also outside of rituals, and just recognizing the nature of mind, abiding, remaining in that nature of mind, outside of philosophical fine-tuning and canonical arguments and all of that. Well, for better or for worse, around this time, the Civil War rather significantly impeded into this happy moment on the mountainside doing these practices. There was a Drikung overlord. Remember the Drikungs who had their monastery destroyed 60 years before. He had a birthmark on his back that meant, it was apparently prophesied that because of that birthmark of a sword on his back, that he was going to go to hell, that he would be reborn in the lowest of the hells, the Avicii hell. And according to this prophecy that he received somewhere, the only way that he could avoid that is by meeting with an incarnation of the Bodhisattva of wisdom, Manjushri. The Manjushri is regarded often in Tibet in relation to the three omniscients. Already at that time, Longchenpa had gained the reputation of being an emanation of this Bodhisattva of Manjushri. So this Drikung warlord sought out Longchenpa. Can you please help me with this birthmark prophecy? And what was he supposed to do? What was Longchenpa supposed to do? Well, he helped out this fellow, giving him some teachings. But in practice, this drew the ire of Changchub Gyaltsen, the warlord, the Pagma Drupal warlord, who said to Longchenpa, there's record of him going up to the mountain where the practices were happening. You need to leave. Longchenpa had to go into exile, which he did. He went to Bhutan for a number of years. And that's a separate story. His time in Bhutan, he's highly regarded there. He made very, very important impression in Bhutan. But I mention this episode because it shows the relationship between the religious and the civil, the secular and the religious. Even when you've taken, a step away from the university, even when you're not trying to be involved in the political scene, that still it can have such an important impact. So I will conclude on a happy note by saying, however, that Longchenpa returns to Tibet towards the end of his life. And at that point, he's so revered, so renowned, thousands and thousands of people are turning out to see him. And among them is the warlord, Changchub Gyaltsen, who has now been given the title of Tai Situ by the Khans. So he has nothing to fear from Longchenpa, and in the end, it's all resolved, the differences, but still, for a while they're very tricky. I think I should close pretty soon here, but let me look at the time. Yes, I will start to wrap up by sharing with you one last slide of these protectors, the Buddhist protectors that were appearing to Longchenpa during these retreats. I think it's very interesting to give you a visual context for the deities that were associated with the Termas and the Nyingma tradition. On the left, you have Ekajati. She's the one that possessed one of the yoginis here among the 8 women and the 8 men practicing the Kondro Nyingtig. ekajati in Sanskrit. That means one braid. And she's a very, very powerful female deity in the Tibetan tradition. One braid is not the only thing. She has one of everything. She has one eye and one tooth, one breast. Goes on like that. So that was a very significant deity to appear. The next is Rahula, who is not seen only as a worldly protector, but a cosmic Dharma protector. Rahula dating back to the Indian cosmology, Rahu being the demon who eats the sun and is known for eclipses, right? Well, in Tibetan cosmology, he's converted to protect the Dharma. And here you see him in his very, very far out form, covered with eyes and heads, multiple heads. You don't see his in this form, this tanka so clearly, but his lower half is a snake body churning. So it was during this period of time in Longchenpa's retreat that his disciples saw Rahula there taking care of things, mixing Longchenpa's ink, for example. So this is very interesting if you just take a step back and think that, these are shared visions. These are people are saying, they're agreeing. This is how close proximity they were in with the deities at this moment in their understanding of their practice. And finally, I give a picture of Guru Drakpa, who is someone that Longchenpa also had a relationship with. Guru Drakpa is one of the incarnations, wrathful incarnations of Padmasambhava, of Guru Rinpoche. And so I mentioned him because when at one point after Longchenpa had left the university, done the practices, and got a sufficient following, he had financial means to enter into restoration of some temples that were falling apart, dilapidated. He worked on a church and a stupa at Samye, and this is what his activities included, was actually helping rebuild these places. And there was one in particular, it's just an interesting story I'll share with you, that he left his hermitage of Organ Zong, and he went to this one sacred site, Shui Lakong, a temple that was built in the 9th century. So he goes basically to this place not only to unearth termas and find treasure texts, but when he's doing this and clearing away the earth, their skulls kept popping up from the ground as he was finding the texts. And these had been placed there as part of suppression rituals in the past, which is to say, Tantra uses whether it's a skull for the bowl to drink out of, or the kongling, the thigh bone as a horn, and these skulls were used as part of the rituals in centuries gone past. And these skulls keep appearing, right, as he's doing this terma discovery. And then the disciples are apparently really getting freaked out by this, and it reads, as the earth was being cleared away from the ruins, there kept emerging skulls which had been placed there as part of these suppression rituals. Darkness fell, and a fierce storm arose, raining stones and earth. One could say maybe that it's referring to hailstones, because certainly they're big enough in Tibet. While Longchenpa recited mantras and put underfoot the skulls, all dancing about. I mean, these skulls are animated, and he's literally physically, pressing his feet on them, subjugating the disturbance. Among the disciples who were there, some saw him, Longchenpa, as Guru Drogpo, one of the terrific forms of Guru Rinpoche. So that's just an example of how he himself was, not incarnating, but reflecting the Buddha activity of the imperial period of Guru Rinpoche, not just, finding the text, but actually, really embodying it in a way that those around him could even see. There is a lot more to discuss here, obviously, from the political to the canonical to identity creation to Dzogchen. I haven't even scratched the surface of, but I'm hoping that this gives at least some context for the political frame of the 14th century and the philosophical differences that were happening at that period, the canonical aspects, and then kind of the wild and woolly, the Wild West happening with the discovery of termites. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Albion, for this lucid and fascinating, survey of the times, of very complex times and very important times in the history of Tibet. It's very interesting that in those times of strife, and conflict and civil war, as you're describing, they're also very creative times. You would think it would be the opposite, but actually, it's one of the most creative periods in Tibet's history. And that's wonderful that you were able to give us this, in such a short time, quite an overview of very important developments. I will take the advantage since I'm first to ask my questions, and then of course I invite the audience to type in their own questions. And let me begin just very briefly. I don't want to monopolize it, but I'm just wondering what happened to the burn at this time.
Well, I would invite people really to understand the larger context of the Bön. I can't recommend Per Kverna's and Dan Martin's text yet because I haven't read it yet, but I would imagine that it ties into this question that you just asked. In the 14th century work of Longchenpa, one does not find it. One does not find him writing against the Bön with his Drupta, with his doxography. He doesn't include them, and I think maybe that speaks volumes in itself. Their texts are not really to be included in the Buddhist canon or the Nyingma, what will be later maybe taken as the Nyingma canon, because, well, they have their own tradition. Historically, of course, they are painted by the Buddhist victors as being, heretical and etc., and are, I think, they drop off the map, after the imperial period on one level, but then they are also brought into the Nyingma tradition, both on a textual level, some of their texts being, there being some crossover. One can start to look specifically at texts if one wanted to do that, but there's no explicit, at least in my understanding here, pushback against them. I think what you have is the imperial period is the important one to watch out for, and that's where Per Kverna and Dan Martin's book is important.
Very interesting. Yeah, because of course, a lot of times in these discussions, the Bön, of course, is at the same time also reacting to the Sarma master narrative and the domination, and they're trying also to formulate their identity. But it's true, they seem to be on the margins, but on the other hand, the very fact there's a lot of practices and the actual philosophy of Dzogchen with the Nyingma school, and even though they trace it in completely different lineages, I think that's a very interesting area of research, that still has not been, and I think it's something to look into for all of us, but how did this happen? How do you have these parallel developments of, the Dzogchen teachings? But This brings me to the next question that I wanted to ask you. How did Longchenpa respond to the Sarma accusations that the Dzogchen Tantras are not authentic teachings because, of course, there is no Sanskrit texts that have been discovered? Did he ever address them directly, other than basically saying that the people who believe that these are not authentic teachings will end up, in the hell realms or in bad migrations? Or did he actually come up with any justification or any kind of rationale why we don't find any Sanskrit texts for this text that supposedly came from India or Udayana or or different places?
That's a very interesting question. I am by no means the end all on this, but I have not found him entering into that type of apologetics with the 17 tantras for Dzogchen tantras, for instance. My understanding is that he is not interested himself in canon creation. He is interested in framing from his understanding what he can contribute as the most what is of the most benefit to his readers. Right? And so for him to include them in the Drupta Zud, in the place that they are, is his way of establishing their importance, but he doesn't enter into this, I believe, canonical narrative on an explicit level.
Very good, fascinating. Okay, I'm not going to ask, I have a lot more questions, but I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about this when we meet, and hopefully you can visit us at some point in Hong Kong. So what I'm going to do is let me have a look at the questions that have come in. And there is one here. He says, thank you, Dr. Butters. You mentioned that Longchenpa studied at Samye and Sangpu as a young man, neither of which at the time were specifically Nyingma monasteries. I know the Nyingma tradition had Katok Monastery in Kham. Were there not any major Nyingma monasteries in the Yarlung Valley that Longchenpa could have attended? When you say the Nyingma tradition was almost underground, did it have no monasteries at all? That's the question. And it's also in the chat if you want to read it, because it seems to be quite a few issues.
This is a very very good question, and unfortunately I would have to do research on this to find out exactly what the context of Nyingma monasteries at that time were. Historically, I don't want to speak out of turn and say that there were not any, but as you mentioned, Samye had moved into an ecumenical place from, even though it was established in the imperial period, it was now very, very much cross tradition. I am not clear that Longchenpa himself would have gone to a monastery had it existed. I mean, I do know that the Nyingma school was mostly local and mostly very, very, small groups and small, hermitages and that type of thing, as opposed to large monasteries. We can say that for sure. But in relation to his own historical, how would you say, path, he went to the university, he studied there, but when he left, it was that he went off on his own inner journey, and doing retreat was the way that the Nyingma tradition, I believe, and still I think over the centuries it's been worn out, and that's their interest, is to go more off on one's own and put things into practice, right? Rather than connect in a large institutional context. There are exceptions to this, of course, but I'm just wondering, even if there was an important Nyingma monastery there in the Yarlung Valley, if he would have wanted to go there, right? And that's maybe why it doesn't show up as prominent in his hagiography.
Okay, thank you. There is another question coming in. about Rendawa and Tsongkhapa. And the question goes like this. Rendawa and Tsongkhapa were critical of Mahamudra's focus on non-conceptual meditation. And they would have a very good reason to do the same to Dzogchen, but it never happened. How could you explain the situation?
If one looks at I just did very cursory work on this question, and the two things that I found is that Tsongkhapa was critical of Longchenpa from his philosophical view, as I mentioned before, taking the third turning of the wheel as definitive. But you're correct that there was an opportunity for them to be much more so. Rendawa, I believe I don't have off of the top of my mind exactly what the textual reference is, but there is some work. If you, I believe, look at the Swatantrika Prasangika work of Rendawa, there is perhaps a connection to Longchenpa's work. Longchenpa was interested also in the Swatantrika Prasangika, and he wrote some, how would you say, out of unusual takes on it. And so maybe one way to understand this is that they understood him as an academic, as someone who had really done the hard work, and Longchenpa is regarded and respected very highly for his academic and for his philosophical presentations. It doesn't form the bulk of his corpus by any means, but they could frame him, he fit into their frame in terms of the philosophical side. And perhaps it was that allowed them to then, how would you say, give him a break on the Dzogchen side, as opposed to Dolpopa, who was breaking the philosophical lines. That's just a thought.
Okay. Thank you very much, Albion, for this. There's one more question. If you could exactly elaborate a little bit more on the relation between Longchenpa and Dolpopa and how Longchenpa reacted. I mean, you mentioned it, but if you could go deeper in his response to Zhengtong experiencing emptiness. What you say that he didn't accept it, he refuted it, but could you talk a little bit more on what did he see the biggest problem with Dolpopa's, let's say, philosophical position?
This is an extreme. This goes into very deep waters, and unfortunately, it's been a while since I looked at exactly that aspect, so I won't go into detail here. But I would say that the problem, I believe, at the simplest level to get to this is the question of reification of emptiness, making emptiness into something more real than it is and that it should be understood as, right? So from the Madhyamaka Nagarjuna point of view, there is emptiness of emptiness. Emptiness itself is empty of inherent existence, as opposed to being a thing of itself. If we were to look at Longchenpa, he sits on that side rather than reifying it. So we don't have historical letters of him, entering into debate with Dolpopa. The closest where one can begin to find something is in his, if you look at my publication at the discussion on the term Great Madhyamaka, right? that is a term that Dolpopa kind of invents. It's a neologism that's like the better Madhyamaka, right? And Longchenpa, at a few points in his philosophical writings, backs into that great Madhyamaka question of what one, the dangers of over reifying, right? When I mentioned that Longchenpa believed that the third turning of the wheel was definitive, from Tsongkhapa's point of view, the danger of that is believing that there is some existence that is putting something after emptiness as the definitive mode, right? And Longchenpa and Dolpopa share this in their reliance on the third turning texts like Uttara Tantra. But where they differ is in the connecting it to the tantric tradition, and when you put this into practice, because it's ultimately there that one has the danger of over reifying something, right? There is the place at which you may still have attachment to yourself, attachment to this ultimate reality, attachment to Kala Chakra as some ultimate thing, and yourself being an incarnation of Kalki, right? And this is where Longchenpa doesn't go. This is where Dolpopa does go. I would advise you to look closer at the work of the great Madhyamaka as the entry point into this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Albion, for this. There doesn't seem to be coming any questions yet, so I have one more. I wanted to ask you, maybe you can give us some reflections on the relation between the Khandro Nyingtik and the Bhima Nyingtik. You mentioned that Longchenpa and his yogis and yoginis, they were practicing the Khandro Nyingtik. And I was wondering about the Bhima Nyingtik. How does that feature? Does it even feature within Longchenpa's active spiritual life? Or was it more that because the Khandro Nyingtik had a more direct relation to Guru Rinpoche, to Padmasambhava, that it was considered more potent as a how do you put it, as a form of practice, as a regime of practice? I mean, I just find this very interesting, the relation between the two. Maybe you can share some comments.
Yeah, again, this is a very, very good question, but it's a very difficult one. And I think in my understanding, have not seen him prioritizing one over the other. I mean, yes, he obviously focused on the Khandro Nyingtik to a great degree, bringing it in, but with the Bhima Nyingtik, and this is referring, obviously, going back to the Vima, as in Vimalamitra. So then, if you look at his Zudun, the books in his corpus that are often translated, referred to in English as the Seven Treasures, there is emphasis in different of those treasure texts on the different Nyingtiks, right? So I think that is the place where you will see them discussed independently, but also in relation. But as you mentioned, also the Nyingtik Gyabshi, the commentarial work that he does outside of the Seven Treasures is really important for understanding these. He treats these different heart drop cycles in depth. And I mean, just as context, I mean, Longchenpa's surviving corpus is quite large. It's believed that he wrote something over 225 texts, something like that. So really, of the extant literature, one can go into detail I would say both independently and finding the relationship this. I'm sorry that I can't give a more detailed answer to that of exactly which of those texts to look at off the top of my head, but the Ningxi Gyabshi is the way. That's the place where you would begin to carve that out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this brings us to this question. I don't know if you read it, but it came in through the chat. If you could talk a little bit more about the Ningxi Gyabshi and what were the 4 different Ningxi lineages? How did
I'm not prepared to go there right now. So I'll pass.
I know this is a very big question, isn't it? And I think it just could not possibly be covered quickly in any significant way. Okay. Are there any other questions?
I can add though that the article that I've just completed for the Oxford Encyclopedia of Buddhism that will be coming out on Longchenpa, I do go into detail on the Ningxi Gyabshi there, and I really parse out what the different Ningxi aspects are related to the 7 treasures and related to the commentarial literature. So it gives a little bit more granularity into this. So I would advise people to look there when it comes online soon, hopefully.
Great, wonderful. I guess this is it. I don't think there are any other questions coming in. Albion, I must say, I really enjoyed your presentation, and on behalf of the Center of Buddhist Studies, I want to thank you for joining us and for giving really this, very stimulating talk about so many different things and really giving a very nice, I think like almost an X-ray vision onto this period of time and the different agents that made it possible. I very much look forward to hearing your lecture next week. So for everyone who is here and listening, Albion will be giving at the same time his second lecture on Khyentse, Dzogchen Khyentse. And we all look very much forward to that. And thank you for joining us once again, and I wish you a good day ahead. For us, it's evening here in Hong Kong, so see you very soon.
Thank you very much, and again, it was a pleasure to speak to you all. Thank you.
Bye-bye.